In a cruel twist of irony, Widow Verity Rowan's only hope of survival was the very thing filling the room with smoke and choking her and her son. The bitter north wind of November 1887 howled through the cracked lean-to roof of the abandoned stagecoach stop. In a dark corner, 9-year-old Eli huddled beneath their only wool blanket, beside an old copper-colored dog, pressed flat against the ground, searching for a pocket of air he could breathe. They had been pushed to the edge. A few rotten sticks and exactly 11 pounds of rye flour were all they had left. The oven had choked and gone cold, because Verity had fed it heavy wood too soon. If this fire died, so would they. Coughing violently as she dragged her son outside, a note hidden in the ash chamber flashed through her mind. Warm the throat before you ask the oven to draw. Verity twisted a handful of dry prairie grass into a tight bundle, lit it, and pushed it deep into the oven's pitch-black throat. The smoke hesitated. Then, with a sudden hiss, the flame was pulled inward. The draft had awakened. Verity did not smile. Her eyes hardened with determination as she looked at her son. Bring me the small branches, Eli, not the thick ones. To protect this fragile spark of survival, they had already paid a heavy price. Just a few days earlier, Verity and Eli still had a real roof over their heads at the Rowan family log house. Hester Rowan, Jonah's mother, managed the grain store, the horse barn, and every acre that fed the family. Enoch Rowan, Jonah's older brother, handled the daily work. Jonah had disappeared nearly a year before while delivering 2 breeding horses to a trading settlement east of the territory. No one found his wagon. No one found his saddle. No one found his body. At first, Hester waited beside Verity. Jonah's winter coat stayed on its peg. His chair remained empty at every meal. Through spring, summer, and into autumn, hope slowly hardened into quiet resentment. Hester began saying Jonah would never have vanished without a reason. Enoch reminded everyone that his growing family needed the small cabin behind the barn. The remaining grain, he argued, would never feed 2 extra mouths through another winter. Before anyone finally spoke the decision aloud, Verity already knew it had been made. That evening, Eli quietly broke his cornbread in half and slipped one piece beneath his napkin for his mother. Verity noticed. She said nothing. One cold morning, Verity walked to the grain shed and found a new lock hanging across the door. A canvas sack already rested on the kitchen table. Hester had packed everything she would allow. She did not raise her voice. Enoch needed the small house before winter, she said. Verity must leave, while the roads still remained open. Inside the sack were 1 wool blanket, 2 changes of clothes, 1 cast-iron pot, a kitchen knife, her mother's shawl, a tin box holding flint, 11 pounds of rye flour, and 7 silver dollars. Hester never looked at Eli while saying the Rowan family could no longer feed those Jonah had left behind. Eli did not cry. He tied his worn boots with a fresh piece of rope, although one sole was nearly gone. Mother and son stepped outside through the side door. Cinder had not found them yet. Behind them, Enoch dropped the heavy bar across the granary door without speaking. Verity and Eli walked west, along the abandoned Cottonwood Trace stagecoach road. Snow had not fallen yet, but the ground was already hard, and the north wind carried the smell of ice. Eli lagged behind because one boot had almost worn through. Verity wanted to stop, but darkness across the open prairie would leave them with only a single wool blanket against the cold. They passed a broken signpost, an empty watering trough, and frozen wagon ruts locked inside old mud. Late that afternoon, just beyond a sparse stand of cottonwoods, they spotted the leaning roof of an abandoned stagecoach stop. Tucked behind the main building was a smaller log cabin. Although a section of the northwest roof had collapsed, the walls still stood stubbornly firm. Leaning against the back wall was a narrow bakehouse lean-to. Of its 3 support posts, only one remained standing straight, while the other 2 tilted heavily, and nearly a third of the roof had completely fallen away. Beneath the remaining cover sat a soot-blackened oven mouth. The rounded baking chamber projected beyond the wall, coated with cracked clay and dead grass. Water from the roof had stained the eastern side for years. Verity saw shelter, a working well, and an oven that might still serve. Eli whispered, "First tonight?" During their first night, Verity propped a rotten stable door across the cabin entrance to block the wind. They shared a thin pot of rye porridge, cooked in the small cast-iron kettle. The next morning, Eli spotted an old dog standing beside the well. Its coat was dark copper, its left ear torn, one hind leg stiff. It neither barked nor approached. Verity tossed it a cold spoonful, scraped from the bottom of the pot. The dog ate slowly before lying against the south wall, where the wind barely reached. Eli named it Cinder because the fur around its muzzle looked like copper ash after a fire. The dog never left. When the wind shifted, it moved beside the old oven foundation. Verity noticed the change, but did not understand why that place felt warmer. On the second night, Cinder slept outside the door. Verity quietly slid part of breakfast. After the first night, Verity inspected the abandoned house and everything surrounding the former stage stop. She counted a 4-foot opening in the northwest roof, dry ground across the southern half of the floor, a working well with one collapsed section, 3 wagon shed posts still standing, and an old storehouse filled with mouse droppings. The lean-to bakehouse stretched about 12 feet along the rear wall. 1/3 of its roof had fallen. 2 eastern support posts were rotting at their bases. The oven mouth remained beneath solid cover, while the rounded baking chamber projected safely beyond the wooden wall. Verity realized the shelter once protected 3 work areas: a mixing table beside the cabin, the space before the oven, and a dry wood corner. Bakers could work through rain without exposing the firebox. Eli measured the opening with a straight stick. The mouth was 19 inches wide and 13 inches high. Inside, the chamber stretched beyond 5 feet, beneath a low arch. The outer clay shell had cracked badly, especially along the eastern side where roof water had flowed for years. Yet every brick inside the dome remained firm. They also found a warped oak oven door, rusted hinge marks, hardened ash, a narrow cleanout slot beneath the hearth, and a packed earth floor still higher than the yard. It had baked hundreds of loaves, warmed strangers, dried wet gloves, and stored split firewood beneath the remaining roof. Even neglected, every surviving feature explained a purpose instead of decoration. Eli looked across the silent bakehouse, waiting for her judgment before touching anything. When Verity cleared the hardened ash beneath the oven hearth, a small brick slipped free, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside rested a 16-inch maple stick marked with burn scars at different levels, an oilcloth pouch holding dried sourdough starter, a warped leather notebook, a simple sketch showing how to place fire under north and south winds, and several loose pages listing fuel, firing times, and bread counts. Across the first page was written Ada Wren, Cottonwood Station, 1861. The notebook contained far more than recipes. It recorded the day the dome cracked after being heated too quickly following rain, the season the oven floor settled and burned every loaf underneath, the amount of wood removed whenever strong winds arrived, and the careful 3-day drying routine before lighting an abandoned oven again. One note filled the margin: "The oven remembers every mistake longer than the baker does." Verity turned each page slowly, while Eli brushed ash from every object before handing it to her. The maple stick was not decoration. Each blackened mark matched a different stage of heat. The dried starter was not dead, only sleeping. The diagrams explained airflow instead of luck. The ledger proved every successful loaf had followed careful observation rather than hope. She understood the hidden treasure was neither gold nor silver. It was accumulated experience purchased through failure, preserved beneath ash waiting for whoever arrived next. Ada could not know Verity or Eli, yet she trusted the notes more than memory. Paper outlasted voices. Careful habits outlasted fear. Verity closed the notebook gently and slipped everything back into the compartment except the journal and the starter. Eli asked whether Ada had expected them. Verity shook her head. No, she only knew someone might need it someday, and she refused to let the lessons disappear completely. Verity tried lighting the oven that same day, because she feared their flour would be gone before they found work. She followed one instruction correctly. Small twigs first, larger wood afterward, but she ignored the note about the cold throat. Smoke rolled backward, blackened the oven mouth, and filled the temporary bakehouse shelter. Eli coughed hard. Verity pulled him outside before the air became worse. Cinder bolted away before the smoke thickened and stood downwind, watching silently. Verity nearly abandoned the attempt that afternoon, but Eli pointed toward the maple heat stick. A small burn mark near its tip carried one word: throat. She opened Ada's notebook again and discovered that the smoke passage had to be warmed with tightly twisted prairie grass before adding the main fire. Verity rolled a fresh bundle, lit it, and held the flame deep inside the narrow throat. Eli used a bent hook to pull an old bird nest from the flue opening. They waited. Nothing happened for several long breaths. Then the smoke leaned inward instead of outward. The draft strengthened little by little until every thread disappeared into the chimney. Verity added only 2 thin sticks and refused to hurry. The fire answered with steady breathing instead of choking. Eli did not cheer. He stood near the doorway, inhaled carefully, and whispered, "It isn't coming back." Verity watched the pale smoke leave without another pause. She finally believed the oven had not rejected them. It had demanded patience. Every careful step mattered. Every shortcut invited another lesson. Eli placed the maple stick beside the notebook before gathering more slender twigs exactly as she had asked him earlier. After solving the smoke problem, Verity believed the oven was finally ready for stronger heat. She added wood more quickly and spread the fire across the hearth. Nearly an hour later, a sharp crack echoed from the eastern side. An old split widened almost half an inch, and a section of outer clay dropped onto the packed floor. Verity pulled the burning sticks from the oven, spread them beneath the remaining roof, and covered them with ash to calm the flames. She refused to throw water inside because sudden cooling could damage the bricks. Examining the outside, she discovered the eastern shell felt colder and darker than every other surface. Part of the lean-to roof had collapsed years earlier. Rainwater from the cabin roof had flowed across that side, soaking the clay, ash, and straw wrapped around the dome. The oven chamber remained dry, yet the protective shell still held deep moisture. Ada's notebook described the same mistake. The first day required only grass, thin twigs, and a shallow bed of coals. The second allowed 1/3 of normal fuel. The third demanded gentle heat until the shell stopped sweating at dawn. Verity and Eli mixed red clay, river sand, wood ash, and chopped straw, pressed fresh mortar into the crack, and leaned a temporary board above the damaged side to divert rainwater. Proper repair demanded 3 waiting days. Their flour could not wait forever. Eli asked what they would eat while the oven rested. Verity measured exactly 1 cup of rye flour, tied the sack closed, and placed it on the highest chair inside the cabin. Nothing else would be touched until the drying was truly complete first tomorrow. Martha Quill arrived after seeing thin drying smoke lifting above the old bakehouse. The elderly widow lived nearly 3 miles away and carried a basket of eggs and a hickory walking stick. The moment she noticed the maple heat stick in Eli's hands, she stopped. She had helped Ada Wren at Cottonwood Station many years earlier. Martha explained that Ada had not become known for perfect bread overnight. People remembered her because she kept the station working through hard winters when others closed their doors. She recorded every failure after her husband cracked another oven by heating it too quickly after rain and lost almost all their flour. She examined Verity's fresh repair without offering praise. Instead, she asked, "Where does Cinder sleep when the oven is cold? Which wind turns the smoke? Which brick dries first? Have you scattered flour across the hearth to read hot spots?" Verity admitted she had no answers. Martha left 6 eggs, but asked for 2 loaves after the oven worked properly. She offered neither flour nor firewood and promised no rescue. Before leaving, she said, Ada left instructions. She did not leave judgment. That part belongs to the next baker. After Martha disappeared, Eli arranged the 6 eggs across the table. He never asked whether they should eat them. Instead, he asked, "How good do the 2 loaves have to be?" Verity answered, "Good enough that she comes back." Then she opened Ada's notebook beside the eggs without another word that evening quietly. After 3 days of slow drying, the patched clay around the oven mouth hardened without opening another crack. Verity prepared the smallest possible test batch, using only a little flour. She revived Ada's dried starter with warm water kept beside a pot of ashes, but almost nothing happened. Martha arrived while the mixture rested and asked, "What warmed the water?" Verity answered, "The ashes." Eli touched the bowl and pulled his hand away. The water had cooled long before. They moved the starter into a small wooden box beside the rear oven wall, where Cinder usually slept. By morning, tiny bubbles covered the surface. Before baking, Verity followed Ada's note. She scattered a thin layer of flour across the swept hearth. Flour near the doorway browned quickly, but one eastern patch barely changed color. They lifted the brick beneath that spot and found the sand below had settled, leaving the brick lower than the others. Old ash had hidden the difference. Verity and Eli packed river sand, crushed brick, and wood ash beneath the low stone. The second flour test browned almost evenly. The system answered because hidden causes had been corrected, not because they hoped harder. Eli watched the bubbles rise again and whispered, "It was still alive." Verity smiled faintly before answering, "It needed the right place to wake." She looked from the bubbling bowl to the repaired hearth. Both had responded only after patient observation replaced guessing. Nothing had been forced. Nothing had been wasted except pride. Outside, Cinder curled against the warm wall again. Martha nodded once before leaving. Verity folded Ada's notebook closed and told Eli to record every change before tomorrow's baking. He wrote carefully, without skipping a single line or measure again. Verity mixed 4 small rye loaves. She could not afford another wasted trial, so Eli recorded every bundle of kindling, the moment the dome turned from black to gray, each loaf's position across the hearth, and every rotation during baking. The first batch was imperfect. 2 loaves nearest the doorway formed thicker crusts. One remained lower because the starter was still weak. The fourth baked evenly, held its shape after slicing, and carried no raw center. Verity offered the first piece to Cinder. The old dog ate quietly before lying beside the oven wall. Nearly an hour after the fire was removed, the bricks still held warmth. Martha returned that afternoon. Verity placed 2 loaves before her exactly as promised. Martha squeezed the crust, smelled the crumb, cut one thin slice, and ate it without speaking. Only then did she remove a small sack of salt and a lively piece of active starter from her basket. "The 6 eggs are paid," she said. Eli wrapped half his bread inside cloth for tomorrow. Verity watched him and finally said, "There will be another baking." She did not celebrate. Instead, she opened Ada's notebook and compared every observation with the fresh results. The hotter front matched the flour test. The repaired floor explained the even 4th loaf. Remaining warmth meant less fuel tomorrow. Martha smiled only after seeing the notes, not the bread. "Keep writing," she said. "Memory fades. Ink waits." Verity handed the active starter beside Ada's dried piece and promised both would remain together. Eli closed the basket carefully before carrying it inside. Outside, the evening wind pressed against the bakehouse, but warm brick answered with steady silence. Tomorrow would demand another careful firing again. After Martha accepted the first successful loaves, she introduced Verity to Nell Harrow, who managed the small mail exchange and wagon stop 4 miles from the abandoned station. Nell bought nothing from pity. She accepted 6 trial loaves and entered every detail into her ledger. Loaves received, loaves sold, price collected, her commission, and the goods returned instead of cash. The first 3 loaves sold to freight drivers. 1 traded for salt and lard. The remaining 2, together with part of the sales money, allowed Verity to carry home a 25-pound sack of wheat flour from Nell's store. For the first time, their flour supply grew instead of shrinking. A few days later, a corn hauler exchanged 12 pounds of cornmeal for 4 rye loaves and permission to water 2 horses at the old well. Martha also introduced a family south of Cottonwood Trace who milled rye and willingly traded fresh meal for bread after every grinding trip. Verity divided every sack into 3 parts: bread for selling, bread for the family, and flour reserved for the next baking. Bread became more flour, salt, lard, and building materials. Part of every return stayed untouched for future needs, instead of disappearing into immediate repairs. Blacksmith Abram Lyle bought a loaf before studying the warped oak oven door. The gap along its upper edge leaked heat. In exchange for 4 loaves during the following week, he forged 2 hinges, a new latch bar, and an iron hook for pulling coals. Later batches earned square nails, hemp rope, an old oilcloth tarp, 2 replacement posts, dry straw, corn seed, and additional flour. Verity and Eli repaired the bakehouse first, replacing 1 rotten post and stretching the tarp across the broken roof. They raised every flour sack nearly 2 feet above the floor. When cinders scratched beneath the rack one night, they discovered a mouse run before the newest sack was damaged. Eli added a separate flour ledger. Work now financed tomorrow's work. By early December, thin smoke rose from the old oven 3 mornings each week. Freight drivers had begun calling the place Wren Oven, though Verity had never given it a name. Orson Pike, owner of the largest freight warehouse and horse exchange in town, noticed that mail wagons lingered longer at the abandoned station. He asked Nell Harrow, who was selling bread there, and learned that Verity lived on land without an active owner. To Orson, the property offered practical value. It stood beside the freight route, held a dependable well, retained a stable foundation, and provided enough open ground for a hay warehouse. He located a distant Wren relative living in Missouri and quietly offered to purchase any remaining claim for very little. Then he visited Hester Rowan. Hester confirmed that Verity owned no land, no longer received support from the Rowan family, and had departed with only the property she had been permitted to take. Orson presented the transfer as protection, arguing that Eli should not grow up inside an unlawful home. Hester signed the affidavit, confirming everything she had just disclosed. She told herself she was protecting her grandson from uncertainty, yet she never asked whether he had eaten well since leaving. Far away, smoke continued rising from the bakehouse exactly as before. After Orson departed, Hester remained alone beside Jonah Rowan's empty chair. For one quiet moment, she rested her hand upon its worn back without sitting. She found it easier to preserve memories of her son than to admit Verity and Eli had learned to build a life without him. Tobias Redd, the surveyor hired by Orson Pike, arrived carrying measuring chains and wooden stakes. He never threatened Verity. Instead, he carefully marked the cabin, the well, the bakehouse lean-to, the oven, and the stable foundation before handing her a legal notice, requiring her to leave within 30 days while an inheritance claim was reviewed. Verity read the paper again and again. Most of the legal language remained unclear. The deadline did not. Martha told her to preserve every piece of evidence: Nell's sales records, flour purchases, and baking accounts, Abram Lyle's repairs, the dates they replaced the bakehouse post and roof covering, every firing recorded in Ada's notebook, and the names of travelers who bought or traded for bread. That night, freezing rain swept across Cottonwood Trace. The oven itself remained protected. The surviving lean-to roof and oilcloth kept water from entering the oven mouth, while the temporary drainage board diverted runoff from the repaired eastern shell. The bakehouse, however, remained unfinished. The new eastern post stood firm, but an older outer support leaned farther beneath the wind. The oilcloth sagged beneath rain and ice. Water bypassed the oven, yet flowed across the kneading bench and the firewood corner. Verity and Eli spent most of the night pushing water from the tarp with a shovel handle, lifting firewood onto higher racks, carrying flour sacks into the cabin, wrapping the starter inside cloth beside the warm oven wall, and bracing the roof with another timber. They saved the flour reserve, the starter, and nearly all their dry fuel. Only the largest batch of rising dough was lost after icy water crossed the bench. By dawn, the ruined dough lay untouched in its wooden trough. Inside the cabin rested the 30-day notice. Outside, ice coated the hemp ropes. Cinder quietly rested his copper muzzle upon Verity's knee. Verity did not throw away the ruined doe. She carried it to Martha Quill, feeding it to her chickens, and trading several fresh eggs in return. The exchange recovered only part of its value, yet failure no longer meant complete waste. Then Verity and Eli repaired exactly what the freezing rain had exposed. They removed the oilcloth, stretched it flat, and raised its outer edge higher than before. Verity replaced the leaning support with one of the timbers earned through earlier bread trades. Together they installed a long crossbeam running from the cabin wall to the new post, creating enough slope for water to keep moving instead of pooling overhead. Along the roof edge, they fastened 2 narrow boards into a rough gutter that carried runoff southward instead of across the oven dome or kneading bench. The rebuilt bakehouse now served 3 clear areas. Dough was mixed and proofed beside the cabin wall. The baking space remained directly before the oven mouth. Firewood rested on raised racks beneath the driest section. The oven chamber still projected safely beyond the wooden wall, while the oven mouth and baker finally stood beneath dependable shelter. When the repairs were finished, Verity visited the land office carrying the 30-day notice. Nell's sales ledger, Eli's flour records, Abram's written statement, dates documenting repairs to the well, bakehouse, and oven, Ada's notebook, and a list of travelers who had stopped there. She never argued that widowhood deserved ownership. She demonstrated that abandoned property had returned to productive use through documented labor. The land agent refused immediate ownership, but suspended eviction until the inheritance claim, improvements, occupancy, and witness statements could all be verified. He warned that Orson Pike possessed enough money to prolong the dispute. Back at the station, Verity mixed another small batch beneath the repaired roof. Meltwater flowed through the wooden gutter before falling harmlessly into the yard. Eli watched quietly. "It goes where we told it now." Verity shook her head. "It goes where the slope allows." That evening she placed the temporary stay beside Ada's notebook inside the hidden compartment beneath the oven. One document protected their future. The other had preserved the knowledge that made the future possible. 3 weeks passed without a decision over the land claim. Orson Pike continued telling freight drivers that buying Verity's bread encouraged unlawful occupation. Nell Harrow kept accepting deliveries because customers continued paying. Abram Lyle answered every complaint the same way. He bought the loaves because they stayed fresh on long trips, not because he pitied anyone. Meanwhile, the prairie began changing. Smoke from the oven chimney drifted lower than usual. Cinder turned his back toward the north, even while eating. Horses at Nell's exchange crowded into the most sheltered corner. Ice formed across water buckets before sunset. Then the wind vanished completely for several hours, leaving a heavy stillness pressing over the grasslands. Martha recognized every sign. A major blizzard was coming. Verity did not increase production to earn more money before the storm. Instead, she prepared the entire system. Firewood was covered and stacked. The oven received 2 gentle drying firings. Extra coals filled the ash chamber. Dense rye loaves baked for storage. Water crocks were filled. Straw covered the well opening. The oven door, roof supports, and gutter were inspected once again. Eli checked each task against his notebook instead of relying upon memory. Orson prepared differently. His warehouse held plenty of flour, yet he stored only the ordinary amount of firewood for his iron stove. Eli looked across the empty freight road and asked how many loaves they should bake. Verity answered quietly, "More than 2 people will need them." The blizzard arrived during the night. Wind drove snow sideways across the prairie, erased the road, and buried the entrances of every low building. By morning, a mail wagon stood stranded near Cottonwood Station. Nell Harrow, the wagon driver, Tobias Red, and 2 cowhands followed the only guiding beacon still visible across the white plain. It was the smoke from the oven. Verity had dried the oven exactly as Ada's notebook instructed. She fired it twice each day, once before dawn, and again shortly before evening. After pulling the coals aside and closing the oak door wrapped with damp cloth, The heated brick mass continued releasing warmth for hours. Bread baked steadily. A pot of beans stayed hot. Wet gloves dried beside the wall. Even after the flames disappeared, the masonry remained comfortably warm. Cinder never lay beside the fire itself. He rested against the warm oven wall, where the heat stayed gentle. Before every batch, Eli checked the temperature with Ada's maple heat stick instead of guessing. Across town, Orson's iron stove burned fiercely, consumed wood quickly, and cooled almost as fast. By the second day, blocked roads prevented new fuel from arriving. With their supply shrinking, Orson and 2 workers abandoned the warehouse and followed fence posts through the storm toward the old station. He reached the bakehouse with ice covering his shoulders. Verity opened the door without a word of triumph. She placed a loaf before him and pointed toward the stacked firewood. "Split that before the next firing." Orson picked up the axe without argument. Outside, the wind continued roaring through the cottonwoods. Inside, the oven had been without flames for nearly 2 hours, yet the bricks still radiated steady heat. Nature had not chosen the better person. It had confirmed the better understood system. Tobias watched everything in silence, from the repaired roof to the working oven, knowing he had witnessed far more than simple occupation. He had seen abandoned ground restored to life through disciplined labor alone. After the blizzard, Tobias Red submitted his survey. The abandoned station now held continuous occupancy, a maintained well, a working oven, regular service for travelers, and documented shelter provided during the storm. Abram Lyle confirmed the repairs had been deliberate rather than temporary. Nell Harrow produced her sales ledger. Martha Quill testified that Ada Wren's station had stood abandoned for nearly 30 years before Verity restored it. When Ada's distant Missouri relative learned that claiming the property required legal expense and long-term responsibility, he surrendered the remaining interest in exchange for a modest payment raised through advance bread purchases organized by the community. Orson Pike withdrew his claim to the property, not out of any newfound generosity, but because the undeniable evidence, public backlash, and mounting legal costs had stripped the scheme of its value. Verity received lawful possession based upon continuous improvement and beneficial use. She placed the certificate beneath the oven beside Ada's notebook. Several months later, a man appeared at the gate, Jonah Rowan. He explained that he had been injured in a freight accident east of the territory. A ranch owner had paid his medical costs, but kept him working until debts tied to 2 secretly mortgaged horses were repaid. Jonah had written once, yet the letter never arrived. Orson admitted he had recognized Jonah's name in an old debt ledger and remained silent because Jonah's return threatened the land dispute. Verity allowed Jonah to speak inside the bakehouse beside the oven. "I came back to my family," he said. She looked toward Eli before answering. "You came back to people who learned how to live without you." She offered him the chance to know his son if he stayed, worked honestly, and never disappeared again. She did not offer the marriage back. Years passed quietly. Jonah rented a room near town and worked beside Abram Lyle at the forge. Every Sunday he arrived to mend fences, split firewood, and patiently earn Eli's trust without demanding it. Verity never returned the bedroom, the property, or the authority she had built herself. If trust grew again, it did so one careful piece at a time. Hester Rowan heard that Verity and Eli now held lawful title but never came to apologize. Years later, when Hester died, Verity took Eli to the funeral. No dramatic reconciliation followed. The bitterness ended there, instead of passing into another generation. Cinder grew old and was buried beneath the cottonwood beside the oven wall where he had first chosen to sleep. Verity placed one weathered oven brick above his resting place. Martha visited less often. When she did, she no longer inspected bread. She listened while Eli explained how the oven stored heat. By the time Eli approached 15, Ada's notebook carried 3 different hands. Ada had filled the opening pages. Verity had written the middle. Eli now claimed the last. One winter morning, Eli lit the oven alone. He warmed the throat first, waited until the smoke leaned inward, then slipped Ada's maple heat stick beneath the arch. Verity watched without correcting him. Eli studied the dark mark, chose to wait longer, and lowered the stick. Verity quietly opened the notebook to a blank page. Outside, the prairie wind still carried winter. Inside, the fire had already been drawn. The bread waited. The bricks did not hurry. Neither did the next baker.